Hello everyone! If you're new to this channel, my name's Cadell Last, and even if you're not new to this channel, this might be the first time that you see my face. I'm doing this video because I really want to introduce myself with a visual complement so you can actually see who I am, and I want to explain in a little more detail who I am in terms of my intellectual history, why I'm doing what I'm doing, and that will hopefully give you a better sense of what this channel's about and what I hope it can be moving forward. So getting into that, of course, who am I is a question of identity, which is really one of the central topics, if not the central topic in all of philosophy. Going back to Plato, Hegel, the foundational philosophers, Kant, Hume, Socrates, really the issue of identity, self-consciousness, the paradoxes therein, the impossibility therein of understanding who we are as both individuals and as a species. So in some sense, it's impossible, or at least difficult, to get at the core of identity, even if there is a core of identity. I know in Lacanian psychoanalysis, getting at identity is seen as basically an impossibility because of the unconscious, that most of our consciousness is unconscious, and that this is sort of constitutive of subjectivity. I think Zizek takes this in a very interesting direction throughout his work by identifying the impossible contradictions of identity and the way that shapes our becoming, vis-a-vis the non-identity of the real, the dissolution of identity, and so forth, or the non-relation in psychoanalytic sessions as compared to relationality. But nonetheless, I want to try here to explore my identity with you and be open about my history and my own contradictions and points of impossibility that have shaped me, because I want to continue to build this channel, and I want people to have a sense of who I am and to see me and to be able to relate directly to me. If you enjoy the lecture series I've been doing, and if you have any advice for future content, it might be good to actually know who I am and know my backstory so that you can see where I'm coming from. So in that direction, I'll start, I suppose, with my intellectual evolution, and I guess that's the most, I sort of feel like that's the most relevant given the nature of this channel. And when sort of thinking about my intellectual evolution, I sort of came to reflect on what I think about story and what I think about origin, because the hardest part of telling any story for me is picking a beginning. How do you pick an origin? Like, is my birth the origin, my first day of school, the day I started university, the day I met my PhD supervisor, the day I started this channel? Depending on when you pick the origin, it will undoubtedly shape the rest of the story. So, and I think that that's the same for the universe as well. So if you want to start a story about the universe, do you start with the Big Bang? Do you start with the origin of life? Do you start with the origin of consciousness? Each starting point will shape the story you want to tell and the main themes of the story. So I think that when thinking about the story from the point of view of my intellectual history, there's one major moment that comes to mind as sort of shaping my trajectory. And that was a day, I think I was 18 or 19, and my family has this summer cottage that we always used to go to called Muskie Bay. And I met someone, I was just by myself looking out at the lake, and I met someone that would become a lifelong friend. He was an older man at the time. I think he was in his 50s. And he started to point at some of the animals in the lake and ask me, do you know how such complex creatures come into being? And at the time, I had never really thought about anything scientific or metaphysical. And I said, no, I have no idea. And he started talking to me about intelligent design. At the time, I didn't know it, but he was a fundamentalist Christian who shaped his worldview around intelligent design. And he ended up sending me Michael Behe, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, Behe. Anyway, you could look it up online, Darwin's Black Box. And Darwin's Black Box is a famous intelligent design book where basically Behe introduces the idea of irreducible complexity. That's the black box, is complexity. And he argues that because we can't explain the complex nature of reality, most specifically the nature of complex organisms, from cells up to megafauna and ecosystems and everything in between, that we need to posit a God. We need to posit a conscious, intelligent designer that drives the process and maintains order and increases complexity. And so the reason why there's such a complex world around us is because there's an intelligent designer who made it. This is a rehashing of an old argument that emerged in the 19th century by William Paley, I'm pretty sure, about the blind watchmaker argument, where you basically run the logic of, if you were walking on a path in a forest and you came across a watch, you wouldn't assume that the watch emerged there naturally. You would assume that it was made by a human being. You would assume that it was made by an intelligent designer. And so Paley basically uses that argument to and apply it to biology. So you could say, for example, that if you just see any animal in the wild, you shouldn't assume that it emerged there naturally. You should assume that it emerged because there was an intelligent designer that made it that way. And of course, if you look up Darwin's Black Box online, you'll see that it's it's written by an academic chemist. And at the time when I was a teenager, I had no idea how to differentiate between a serious scientific work and a work that was, you could say, pseudoscientific. No, and there's ambulances outside. But in either case, at the time, I entertained the idea openly, and I reflected on it a great deal, and it stimulated my imagination, the parts that I understood. But I recognized that they were Behe, in the book, was very anti-Charles Darwin. So I wanted to understand. I didn't know who Charles Darwin was, or at least I maybe had heard of him but didn't know his work. So I went to the bookstore, I bought On the Origin of Species, I bought some other books on evolution in the biology section, and I started to get fascinated with the theory of evolution, and I thought that it was a very compelling theory. Of course, for anyone who doesn't know the theory of evolution, it was proposed by Charles Darwin, which is basically centered around the mechanism of natural selection. And the mechanism of natural selection is basically like a differential algorithm that functions on the basis of differential survival and reproduction. So why are there all the complex organisms that exist in the world can be explained basically due to processes of natural selection where there are more organisms born than actually reproduce, and the organisms that do reproduce pass on their genetic information to the next generation, And the reason why there's the complex forms that exist is because they've adapted to that environment. Of course, that's a simplistic base. That's a baseline evolutionary. Those are the fundamental baselines of Darwinian evolution. So at the time, I definitely started to feel like evolutionary theory was more convincing than the intelligent design argument, or at least more intriguing. And I started to wonder about reality and religion and science, and what was real. Was evolution real? Was God real? Were they mutually exclusive? Could you believe in God if you believed in evolution? Could you believe in evolution if you believed in God? These types of things. And in this journey, I started more and more to fall down the hole of evolutionary biology and evolutionary anthropology, specifically evolutionary anthropology, because I was interested in humans, and I've always been interested in humans, because I think we're a very strange animal. It's a very strange creature, and I still believe that. And basically, it seemed like all of these problems were about, basically, in terms of the evolutionary theory, were the problems of complexity. Which is still a huge problem. It's not like the problem of complexity is resolved. I think it's an ongoing problem that is approached in physics, is approached in complex systems, is approached in systems theory, is approached in basically all subjects have to deal with the issue of complexity. Why is the universe so complex? Why did it start so simply? What are the consequences of complexity? These types of things. These are unanswered questions for the most part. But what I was attracted to in biology and anthropology was that you could approach these questions rationally. You didn't have to posit an intelligent designer and basically assume that this problem was unsolvable to the human mind, that is a black box, so that you can't solve it. That you have to posit something supernatural to solve it. So definitely at that time, again, I became very attracted to atheism as well, and the atheists that were dismantling religion and viewing religion as a anachronistic, historical, cultural, institutional form that was no longer necessary, and basically a mechanism of control for controlling humans. So I became attracted to thinkers like Richard Dawkins, the four atheists, basically Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and others. And I started to basically become a scientific materialist. And then I think that a big curveball was thrown my way, or a new attractor, I would probably say, came onto my horizon when I encountered Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near. When I read The Singularity is Near, it had an enormous impact on me. If for anyone who hasn't read The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil, the central claim of the book is that if one thinks in terms of a general cosmic evolutionary worldview, where you're not just thinking in terms of biology and life, but the whole universe, then one's led to the view that human beings, that we are a part of a continuous process of evolution, which goes through discontinuities, from physics to chemistry, and chemistry to biology, and biology to culture, and culture to technology, but that we are part of a continuous process of evolution that is, in fact, accelerating across time, so that with each emergence of a new process of evolution, that process will change at a faster rate than the previous process. And that if one basically extrapolates this process, that when we reach closer to analyzing what's going on at the present moment, specifically with technological systems and computer evolution and the information evolution that we've gone through, which ultimately the book is trying to explore, that we have the logic of a type of confrontation with exponential change, that change doesn't happen linearly, that change on the grandest scale happens exponentially, which basically means that in the next 50 years, things are going to change at a faster pace than that. Basically, there'll be more change in the next 50 years than there have been in the previous thousands of years. So if you compare humans in the year 2000 to humans in the year, any time in human history, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, there would be more similarity between those humans in terms of their daily lives, in terms of the way they perceive the world, in terms of the way they conceive the world, than there would be between humans in the year 2000 and humans in, say, 50 years or 100 years. That, this was a major theme of the book, and something that structured a lot of the narrative was that humans in 50 years or humans in 100 years would be basically uploading their consciousness onto digital substrates, whether quantum computers, or at least computers that were processing information a lot faster than computers today, and that as a consequence of that, our entire environment, our entire experience, our entire perception, our conceptions would be qualitatively different. It would be more similar to the transition between it would be more homologous to, say, comparing the consciousness transition that happened between great apes and humans, where you're going to another level between humans and the future of future consciousness, which wouldn't necessarily be human. It might be post-human or transhuman. And so these ideas resonated with me. I found them extremely convincing. But at the time, I didn't realize it, but I was kind of heading into like a type of coincidentia positorium, like a historical, the historical realm of oppositional determination, where originally in my worldview, I started to entertain the idea of intelligent design, where complexity was generated by a superconscious designer, to a naturalist evolutionary view where self-organized complexity was going to generate a future superconscious designer. And like the themes and the culture, for anyone who knows, in technological singularity communities is quasi-religious. They sort of believe that God is going to emerge in the future. So it's not that God exists now directing evolutionary processes, but rather that God is kind of like an omega point, or something that we're tending towards, that the attributes that we describe of God are things that are the logical necessity of evolutionary processes. So in that sense, paradoxically, I became kind of a believer. I started to believe in the technological singularity. I thought that immortality and transcendence, obviously things that are fundamental features of the Christian worldview, were, in some sense, our singular destiny, that in the future we would look back on the human species as an evolutionary relic, that higher mind would direct being, and that what was imminent to being was the creative drive of the mind, which would be something godlike. And the more research I've done since then, the more I realize that these are not necessarily new ideas. These are ideas that have had their genesis, throughout the history of philosophy, basically. It's just that, Kurzweil's book was a type of part of the early 21st century zeitgeist or something like that, and he did add, I think, something new with sort of being able to situate, the information revolution and the possibility of artificial general intelligence into a grand cosmic evolutionary frame, which clearly resonated with certain scientific materialists. You know, and although my views on it have complexified over time as to what this means for humanity and what this means, you know, to the degree to which we can predict the future with any degree of accuracy, at the time, my mind was definitely concerned with really the personal and civilizational consequences of this worldview. Like, how in the world could 7+ billion humans either transition from our current state to a higher level of intelligence and consciousness, which seemed impossible, and probably, you know, I still think it seems to be difficult. Or would it be more likely that we're facing a horizon where higher intelligence evolves out of us and leaves us behind, and either we become evolutionary dead ends, or we just we become collateral damage, and sort of yeah, I mean, we become, you know, analogous to what gorillas or chimpanzees are in relation to human civilization. So when I was an undergraduate student, I started as an undergraduate student studying evolutionary anthropology and biology, and focused on human evolution. In the day, I would be focused on the evolutionary theory, and in the night, I would be studying, like, researching technological transcendence and trying to understand how I could make sense of technological singularity theory in relation to questions about sexuality, reproduction, economics, politics, science, religion, education, and so forth. And then the result of this mixture was something that you can still find online, a show, a blog, and a podcast I created called The Advanced Apes. And the animated channel of The Advanced Apes you can still find on the channel now. Which was a really interesting project that I engaged with, which tried to merge my interest in evolutionary theory with my interest in transhumanism. So at that stage in my career, my undergraduate career, those two things were still not sort of professionally merged in my mind. But that all changed when I started to consider graduate school and became more certain that I wanted to focus on this more seriously and academically. But it was hard to know where to do it. I sort of felt at the time like I was in a, you know, strange quasi-religious group of technological singularitarians that were kind of like science-y and like science and you know, thinking from a scientific perspective, but there weren't any places where I could, you know, professionally engage, and that was until I found the work of the Global Brain Institute, which is actually where I started to do my PhD, and I'm still doing my PhD. I hope to finish sometime next year, hopefully. And at the Global Brain Institute, I met thinkers like Francis Heiligen, who you can look up online. He's my PhD supervisor. Ben Goertzel, John Stewart, Clement Vidal, and you can look all these people up online. They're very interesting futurists and systems thinkers and cyberneticians who are all thinking about basically the future of human consciousness. And what attracted me to the Global Brain Institute was, and I think it also led to an evolution of my worldview beyond sort of the artificial general intelligence, technological singularity worldview, which was a view of the human system as a whole. And that when you view the human system as a whole, like as a historical entity, as the history of civilization, so like from a Hegelian perspective, like focusing on the phenomenology of spirit and the historical development of spirit, then you are getting a much broader perspective on the possibility of technological singularity and also the ability to interpret what a technological singularity would mean. You're not just thinking about artificial and general intelligence, or you're not just thinking about the evolution of computers, but you're trying also to integrate that knowledge with an understanding, a historically well-developed understanding of psychology, sociology, anthropology, which dramatically complexifies the problem and the possibilities. So towards that end, I, once getting into the program, started focusing on the concept of metasystem transitions. And metasystem transitions are basically qualitative changes in system organization, I think, is the best way to define a metasystem transition. It was a concept that was introduced by one of the theoretical founders of my research group, Valentin Turchin, and he proposed that evolution operated on multiple levels, with each level requiring a new control system. And that the new control system was necessary to maintain a new organization. So, for example, in a cybernetic history of the universe, you can understand the history of complexity as the history of relations between different parts within a whole that require a type of informational control system in order to keep everything together. So immediately when I was thinking about this concept, I applied it to the human system because I was interested in human evolution. And in my contribution to this idea was that you could understand the human system and the history of the human system as sort of a relationship between information, energy, and control. And I developed a sort of feedback loop model between information, energy, and control that I applied to what we call metasystem transitions. So with the first metasystem transition being a transition to hunter-gatherer existence, and that was an organization that was enabled by language, was enabled by the emergence of the logos, as an information processing medium, and this allowed humans to form new units that could acquire higher levels of energy. So like if you look at the anthropological literature, as soon as humans emerged, the units that humans were forming were capable of acquiring much more meat and much more diversity of resources, in part because of the development of technology, in part because of the developing of cooking, in part because of the development of a whole number of things. But the ability of language, the ability to communicate, held these groups together in a higher level of order, and they were able to form a new control system, which we call hunter-gatherer tribes or bands, which were much larger and qualitatively different than anything you find in the great ape world. And then the second metasystem transition, I would say, was the transition to agriculture, the emergence of civilization. And so in that transition, the information processing medium that emerged was writing, obviously, where you could then sort of materialize logos. You could sort of keep track records, and you could keep track of information for longer durations of time and share it with more people more reliably. And this allowed us to form sort of units that were able to, again, extract higher levels of energy. So, of course, with agriculture, with being able to be sedentary and being able to get more productivity out of the land. And this was stabilized with, again, a higher control system. So we went from bands and tribes to more like chiefdoms and kingdoms. And that was a new level of organization that stabilized itself across time. Before the third metasystem transition, which I would say would be something along the lines of the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, the information medium that enabled that would be the printing press, which allowed us to take our writing and be able to make far more copies, far more reliably than was possible before the printing press. And that sort of laid the informational groundwork, I think, for the basically the Industrial Revolution, the fossil fuel revolution, that we mastered certain types of scientific knowledge because of the explosion of information that enabled us to control a new energy resource, and then also enabled us to stabilize a new control system of nation states and eventually international networks. And within this frame of thinking, I started to apply this sort of triadic structure between information, energy, and control to understanding the transition I think we're going through now, where now we have sort of the information processing medium is the internet, and doing something like this, making a channel like this wouldn't have been possible, obviously, at any other time in human history. You could technically be watching me from anywhere in the world, and people can there's a new level of communication, there's a new level of conversation. But what hasn't happened yet is a kind of integration of the internet with a new energy system and a new control system, which I think, is probably imminent or at least necessary, given the ecological problems that our planet faces, and the risks of destabilization if we don't transition our energy system and our control system. So that's sort of how I view the view of human civilization from a metasystem perspective, that we undergo qualitative changes. This doesn't necessarily mean that the next change will be a utopia. It just means that the next stage will be a higher level of integration with different problems that we'll have to solve, that we're not thinking about now. And then maybe, who knows whether there'll be again a further metasystem transition. I guess that is a post-human question, and a question that no one, I don't think anyone really knows. So that structured my early PhD research, and throughout my PhD research, I've become obsessed with philosophy, in part because I realized, I think more and more, that my phenomenal consciousness, my action in the world, was going to be the necessary ingredient to being a part of the things I was talking about, being a part of a metasystem transition, being a contributor to the realization of another type of system. And so in that sense, I found philosophy, and specifically psychologically informed philosophy, to be the go-to resource for enlightenment. Not the only resource for enlightenment, in the sense that I have also experimented with meditation. I've also experimented with, my own anthropological interests of visiting many different communities and many different cultures, and also psychedelics, which I think are a very important tool for enlightenment, and I've written about that a little bit on my blog. But basically coming to an appreciation of psychologically informed philosophy, with, of course, now if you're following the Zizek lecture videos, I believe Slavoj Žižek is an integral figure in this movement towards psychologically informed philosophy. And I've sort of come to see psychologically informed philosophy as a antidote to a more social constructionist or social deconstructionist oriented philosophy, where things are usually framed in terms of social systems, and things are usually framed in sort of power dynamics, And I think that there is a lot of utility and a lot of usefulness in terms of understanding sort of philosophies that are more socially oriented. But what they miss for me is the grounding of the loop between the psychological entity, the existential entity, and the social system. And I think the better we understand our psychologies, the better we understand how our minds work, the more we are willing to engage introspection, and the more we're willing to engage the greatest thinkers that have ever lived, the more informed our action is going to be, and the better people we are going to be. And sort of that is where I am now in terms of building this channel and trying to make a real impact in the philosophical community, and hopefully able to help others explore complex ideas that will then set another chain of reactions, just to make the world a more reflective place and a more nuanced place in terms of discourse, in terms of conversation, in terms of what our future is, in terms of what is possible and what we want. What do we want the world to look like? Because that is ultimately up to us right now. And I think that there are so many changes going on in the world, and it's in some sense so disorienting, that we need new conversation and we need new ideas. So that's my goal, that's my aim, that's in some sense who I am. So yeah, like, I guess I'll end by saying, not to make this video too long as it already is, who I am is, other than a radical process of becoming in relation to impossibilities, someone who is trying to be a part of the future of a psychologically informed philosophy. And that comes from a understanding of a history of evolution and a belief that we are a part of a future qualitative transition where politics, economics, sexuality, everything will have to be rethought fundamentally. Yeah, so I hope that gives you a better sense of who I am, and you know who's giving these lectures and who's building this channel. And I hope to communicate with you in the future. And thanks to everyone who has supported this channel. Again, if anyone wants to support the channel, the best way to do so is via Patreon, and you can find a link in the description for that. And that's really it. So thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you in the future.